speak. I think you just have to shout.
It was triggered by the bird comment. It's possibly one of the issues that birds have short frequency, they breed a lot, or they have short breeding cycles, whereas whales, I'm assuming, have quite long breeding cycles. So human changes change quickly, but whales, I'm assuming their breeding isn't going to keep up with that, because they're so long-lived.
So the question is really about the whale's life cycle. Does that make them especially vulnerable? And the answer is yes. As a rule of thumb, their life cycle looks a little bit like the human life cycle. So they can reproduce, most of them in their teens, some of them a bit earlier, some of them a bit later, and then they can live for decades, and they produce generally only one calf during the breeding season. Not necessarily every breeding season, again there's some variation. Porpoises are very enthusiastic breeders, and some of the larger whales reproduce very slowly indeed, and so there's some variation there. But yes, it does make them vulnerable. They obviously, if you are able to produce a lot of offspring, that's a different approach to just producing a few offspring. And particularly, like us, they have long periods of parental care. I come back to the noisy children and how you tolerate them. That's part of our biology, and they have the same thing. There's a lot of information transfer. If you want to be a successful dolphin, you need to learn from other dolphins, not just your mother, but other dolphins, where to find the food, how to coordinate with others. This is learnt behaviour. And that, of course, presents then a problem for animals that are reared in captivities. They may not know how to exploit their environment. They may not have learnt anything other than how to live within concrete tanks. And that's, of course, another issue. Thank you for the question. And there's another one.
And there's one more. Yeah, I'm going to take one more question, and then we'll move on to Ariel's presentation. Yes,
Oh yes, you mentioned that it was relatively new discovery that whales, which generally communicate at low frequency, were being affected by high frequency sonar. Could you say a little bit more about that and how that's established and discovered?
Yeah, so that's actually this very latest piece of research that flickered onto breakfast time TV. And this was part of the significance of that piece of work, is that previously we pretty much thought, the scientific community, that noises that animals would be vulnerable to would be within the range of noise that we think they're using. So in other words, they would hear the same kind of range and be vulnerable to that range of noise as the same range that they are producing. Very difficult to test the hearing of a big free-ranging whale, hence the assumption. And we now know that that's not true. So the noises they were using were not high frequency, but they were higher frequency than the very deep, fantastically deep, loud noises that blue whales were producing. So that's a problem, that's a new issue.
And how did they find out, how did they find that?
So they played in the sounds. They had the tags on the animals, and they watched what the animals did. The animals did a range of things which varied with what the animals were doing at the time, which is kind of what you'd expect us to do. If we're distracted doing something else, if we're busy feeding or breeding, we might put up with a little bit of disturbance. Or not. Okay, so there's a context to it as well. But the animals changed their behaviour in the ways that they described, and they were able to show that, and they were able to show that the noise that they were reacting to was of this higher frequency type, similar to some of the military sonars. And as I read out the abstract, I gave a little bit of emphasis to the fact that the noises they were using were not of the same power as some of the actual military sonars themselves.